my talk is about responsive typography with variable fonts. And when I mean responsive, I don't just mean viewport size, which is pretty much what people think about when we think about responsive web. I'm actually talking about how we can change our typography to a whole bunch of different inputs. But before I get into the specifics about that, I will, at the beginning of the talk, just run through the sort of basics of variable fonts as well, so you can get started if you're not super familiar with them. Just quickly, if you use Twitter, I'm on Twitter as Mandy_Kerr. I will tweet out at the end a link to all of the demos that I'll show you and all of the examples, so you can check those out later. Or if you get impatient and want to have a play with some of them, you can go to Mandy Michael on CodePen, and there's a collection up there called Variable Font Experiments that you can check out. Very, very important piece of information. This is my dog Jello, and the reason that I like to mention it is that a lot of my demos use the word Jello in it. And if I don't mention that it's my dog, it confuses people and they think it's the food. But actually, anytime it says Jello, I'm actually referring to my dog Jello. That's his Instagram if you want to follow him. He's super cute. Now, if you're miss anything while you're following along, you don't have to worry about taking lots of notes or anything. The first part of my talk about getting started and how to write the code in CSS and the JavaScript stuff I'll talk about a bit later. That's all up on my site, variablefonts.dev. It also links through to some example sites where there's other like resources that you can go through. So you can check that out later. I'll have a post in a few weeks about how I made a variable font as a developer. So that might be of interest to some people if you want to give it a whirl after the talk. Now, I kind of wanted to mention how I got into variable fonts because normally when people talk about them, they kind of came at it from a very different perspective to me. Lots of people are interested in variable fonts for performance reasons, many people for web typography reasons. I don't make fonts. I'm not a web typography expert. I'm not a font performance expert either, but what I do like is to play around and tinker with things. And a few years ago, I started making text effects like these. And they're just HTML and CSS and a normal text. So while I was playing around with these, I saw a post about variable fonts back in, I think it was 2016. And I was like, these are cool. And then I made variable fonts and I'm like, I'm going to give, then I made text effects. I'm going to give these variable fonts a go. So I started adding variable fonts into my text effects. And that's kind of where I realized that they present us with a lot of unique opportunities that a standard font just can't provide us. And the reason for that is that a variable font is one font file that acts like multiple fonts. And what I mean by that is that with a standard font, say you might have several different font weights, so a bold, a light, a regular, and they all exist as separate individual files. With a variable font, all this information exists within one file. So that means that you kind of are reducing the number of fonts that you need to load into your page. And the way that this is accomplished comes down to how they're created. So a variable font contains one or more axes that provide different variations between different extremes. So for example, a light font weight to a really heavy black font weight. So it might be like 100 to 900 if you're used to the number of values. Now you can still have all of the styles that you're used to, like regular and bold or semi-bold. They're what's known as a named instance, but we also gain the ability to interpolate between these values. So along with all of those standard values that we're used to, we can also have all of the values in between, including decimal places. And what that means is that we can animate between the values, creating these really smooth transitions between each of the variations. But we're not limited to one axis at a time. So we don't just have to animate from light to heavyweight. A variable font can contain thousands of axes, and the interpolation doesn't just apply to one axis at a time, but the combination of these axes as well. So you could have a weight and a width animate or transition at the same time. Along with that, you could maybe have something that's a little bit different. So this is a font by David Berlow. It's called Decovar. It's an experimental variable font, and it's my favorite to play with because it's got a lot of really interesting creative axes. I have a lot of demos that use this font because it's so cool, which we'll look at later. But what I wanted to do before we get into the cool stuff is just a little bit of the housekeeping things that are always important that comes up when you're talking about technology that's maybe a little bit new. So first up, browser support. It's really good. We can use variable fonts now. There are a lot of places that are using it in production sites right now. It does rely on newer operating systems. So if you're a couple of versions or a few versions behind, you might find that it doesn't work in Firefox, for example. It'll still be fine in Chrome because that has its own renderer, and as a result, Edge as well now. But that's not a huge problem. This is kind of covering most of the major browsers, IE obviously not being developed anymore, doesn't support them. But if you do need to support IE, you could either just have it fall back to a system font, or you can use something like CSS feature detection to fall back to a standard font. So you would use that exactly the same way that you would for other features in CSS. You define your fallback with the normal source sans font, for example, and font weight. And then you can define the support syntax and check for font variation settings, which is the variable font, one of the variable font CSS properties. And then you can put your variable font inside that. So you can have it kind of fall back in older browsers if you want to. Now, the way that we actually use variable fonts in our websites is pretty much the same way that we would do things right now with a standard font. We still use font face. We still set up our font family name. The source is all the same. There is a format option for variable fonts. You should include, but it will work without it. So it doesn't really matter if it's in there or not, but it is good for good practice to actually include it. The main difference, and this is the most important part, is how we define variations for descriptors like font weight, font stretch, and font style. So with a standard font, if we had, multiple font weights, so a bold and a lightweight or regular, which is pretty common, we'd set up an individual font face block for each version. So you'd have your bold font face block, your regular font face block, and any other ones that you needed. With a variable font, we don't need to do that. We just need the one. And instead of having single values in our font weight, we specify a range. So Source Sans actually has a font weight range of 200 to 900. So I can say, I want a font weight range of 200 to 700. And then when we reference that in our CSS, we can pick any number between 200 and 700, and that will now be our font weight. So for example, I went with 658.756, which, because there's interpolation and we have decimals, is a totally valid font weight. Now, this is really good for something like weight because we already have a CSS property that we can use. This is known as a registered axis. At the moment, there are 5 registered axes: weight, width, slant, italic, and optical size. And they're all mapped to pre-existing CSS properties. So we've got font weight, font stretch, font style is used for slant and italic, and then font optical size. Now, if we want to use something custom, like those examples I showed you with Decovar, we need a new CSS property because they're not, we don't have a font weird blobby thing CSS property. So the way that we would access custom axes is with the font variation settings property. And that enables us to define as many registered and custom axes as we need. So the way that we do that is by referencing the 4-character string of the axis that we want. So that code is determined by the person that made the font. So in my example, I named it. So it's 4 character of Jello. And then the number next to it is the value of the axis that you want to represent. So much like we had 200 for weight, we can pick whatever number range, whatever number value we want within the range available for our custom axis. Now you can separate this by comma and have as many axes as you want, as long as they exist in the font. You can use a registered axis in font variation settings. So say you wanted to reference weight, it would be WGHT and then the value. However, typically it's not really recommended. It's much easier for you to manage your typography if you're using the pre-existing CSS properties, mainly because people already know what to do there. And anytime you want to change the value in the font variation settings, you kind of have to update everything. So if you were transitioning or animating, you have to reference all the properties. You can't just say, I want to change font weight. So it's much better to use the pre-existing properties when they're available rather than whacking it all in font variation settings. So one thing that I do like to mention, because people always ask, where can I get variable fonts from? There's a lot of great variable fonts out there. v-fonts.com has a whole list of them. I've got a link at the end. But if you're a Google Fonts fan, they support variable fonts. They have about 56 variable fonts available for use. They're all free, which is great because you don't have to worry about licenses. And they, when you go to the page, there's like a checkbox that says show only variable fonts, and you can do that and it'll filter them all down. Now, the API for it is slightly different to how the original V1 version worked, but it is pretty similar. The main difference that I just wanted to show was, you'll see that it says CSS2 now, but also at the end where we reference the axis that we want. So after the name of the font family, you have a colon, the name of the axis, so weight, for example, an @ symbol, and then you can define the axis value group. So in this case, the range of the weight that we want. So I've said 300 ... 700. And that's how you define the range. Now, of course, you can just copy and paste the code from Google, which they will provide. But if you want to know exactly how it's built up, I actually have a post on variablefonts.dev that runs through all this. And there's a heap of other great posts that I list in there that will run through it as well. Now, one thing before we get into some extra parts that I wanted to mention is if you want to just play around with variable fonts in an existing site, or you want to design in the browser, Firefox has this great fonts panel where if you inspect the page, you click into it, go to fonts, you'll find that they actually have little sliders for variable fonts, so you can sort of adjust it within the browser. Really, really good if you want to try and find a specific weight that works within your design. It's really handy and I've used it quite a bit, so I highly recommend you check it out. It's a good little panel. Right, so we know how to use them. I want to briefly chat about font performance, because whenever you talk about fonts, it is very, very important that you're considering performance. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people come to variable fonts because of the likelihood of performance benefits. Now, what I want to say is that a variable font is still a font, so you still need a good font performance strategy. There are things like subsetting, font display, which the Google API has by default, Google compression good compression formats like WOFF and WOFF2. These are all important and you still need to consider them. A font is still a font, whether it's a variable font or one of the sort of standard versions. I have actually written an article that runs through performance in detail of my experiments with variable fonts, but I want to touch on a couple of the basics first. Things that are kind of specific to variable fonts where you can get some value. And the first one is reducing font requests. So at the moment, when we would think about reducing the number of font requests, it's basically removing the number of fonts from our site, so we're loading less files. And typically, we'd be weighing up the cost of design over the cost of performance. And then we'd have to justify the cost before adding new font styles in. Well, at least we should be. But with a variable font, because the data for, say, all of the weights that we want, so maybe regular, bold, and semi-bold, exist within the one file, we're already reducing the number of fonts just by using a variable font. The added benefit to that is that not only do we get the original weights that we wanted, but we gain all those extra interpolated values as well, which means we have a lot more design opportunity to work with. So we can just reduce the number of font requests by using a variable font, and that's all great. However, and a lot of people ask this when I bring the reducing font request stuff up, if all of the data is in one file, that's probably going to have an impact on the file size, right? And the answer to that is maybe. In my experience with the testing that I've done, variable fonts are either about the same or better than the combination of the standard fonts on your website. And a bit of a quick example for this, I took Source Sans Pro, the standard version, it's available on GitHub, and the variable font version. In the WAF2 format, which is a good compression format, a single weight of Source Sans Pro is 111 kilobytes. The variable font is 112. So for a variable font, you get the single weight plus all of the other weights, plus all of the interpolated values for an extra kilobyte. And in my opinion, that is a very good, valuable 1 kilobyte extra. And I think it's totally worth it. Now, 112 kilobytes is still a lot, especially for a compressed format like WAF2. And that's because Source Sans is a very, very large font. It has a lot of character support and a lot of language support. So you should absolutely consider subsetting. When I subset this font, it dropped down to 26 kilobytes for the variable font and 16 for the single weight. So even if you had two versions of the single weight, the variable font is still better in its subset form. So with that in mind, if you can get performance benefits by using a variable font, it means that we get all this extra design opportunity with very little increase or potentially better file sizes than we were having already. Of course, this does depend on the font. Like, I don't want everyone to go away and go, oh, variable fonts are better for performance. It's going to depend on the font you use, how many styles you have in your site, and how many axes are in the font itself. So, definitely you want to consider it and have a look into it. If the fonts that you're using, like Source Sans, for example, have a variable version, you should totally check out if it's a better option for you. But it may or may not be better depending on how you're using fonts and how the variable fonts are made. So it's worth checking out, but it may not work exactly the same way as this example does. So with that in mind, if we're not limited by technical considerations, then that means creativity can determine our choices. So for example, this design uses 13 different font weights, and most of them don't exist in the standard font form. What we get here is a lot more flexibility in our design opportunities. Designs which would have been impossible or a heavy burden on performance are now completely possible and available to us. And that means that the tone, the intent, the rhythm, and the meaning of our words can be changed and represented in a more effective way with less worry about the impacts overloading in too many font weights. And we can combine variable fonts with other CSS techniques to create Photoshop-like text effects like this one without the impact of needing multiple fonts to create layers. I made this one at Christmas and it's one of my favorites, and I kind of wish more people liked it because I think it's really cool. The other thing that you can do is create logos. So like you would with SVG, but with a font instead. So I actually made this. This is the logo from my favorite anime, Haikyuu, which is a volleyball sports anime. It's like super inspirational and every character is amazing. And I built the animation into this font. So you can write the letters out. It's a normal H1. It says Haikyuu. And then I just animated it so that it goes from the start point to the end point of the axis and the ball bounces through the letters. Now, you could do this in SVG, but you could also do it in text and create responsive logos that adjust in different positions, or like maybe a compressed version and a wider version, depending on where you want to put it in your site or even in your printed designs. And speaking of print, we can embrace all of the learnings that we have from print design and Photoshop-like effects and combine them with variable fonts and things like CSS grid, blend modes, shapes, and we can use them to represent our content in much more interesting and more engaging ways. This design's probably not the best, but I did just want an excuse to have lots of pictures of Jello up. But you can kind of see how I've used this variable font in a number of different ways in different places within the design. And there's nothing stopping us from doing that with a variable font, because once we put it in there, we have access to the full range of the axis. But unlike designing for print, when we're designing on the web, we can embrace that interactivity and flexibility. Because variable fonts have that interpolated range of values, we can create animations or transitions with our text using techniques that you're probably already familiar with. So as an example, this demo was the second variable font demo that I ever made. It uses Decovar. It is just a H1 with some CSS, so it's editable, selectable, searchable. It's accessible via a screen reader. You can copy and paste it because it's just HTML and CSS and a variable font. And in order to actually get it to animate this way, we only need a few lines of CSS. So in this example, I've got my font family of Decovar. I have my animation property with some values in it. But the most important part is I'm using the keyframe animation syntax. So at 0%, I've got my font variation settings, and I'm going to use two axes. One is called inline and one is called skeleton worm. They're both custom, so we're using font variation settings. I'm going to leave inline at 1,000 for the whole thing, so that doesn't change. But I am going to start at 0, which is the minimum value for the skeleton worm axis. And then at 50%, we'll move it to 1,000, and then it'll just loop back round to 0. In my animation property, I just have to reference the name of my keyframes, pick a duration. I've got my linear easing, and it'll just run infinitely. And that's literally all you need in order to get the animation to work. Now, there is a little bit of CSS for texture for the final, I guess, effect. But the heavy lifting and the I guess, hard part is the actual animation itself. And the font does all that for you, because David, who designed the font, created the beginning and end states and the interpolation that we need in order to have this kind of growy text effect. And I think that's really amazing. And it gives developers and designers a lot of power in their variable fonts. And if you can make a font, you can make something that suits your needs specifically. And when it comes to the animations and interactions and things like that, you can do all sorts of things. Like this is just a basic hover transition. So when you hover over it, one of them goes bold and one of them goes narrow, I think. Actually, I think it's width, so wider and more condensed. You can simulate handwriting effects with this font by Underwear. Underwear actually makes some really interesting and amazing variable fonts that you should totally check out. I really like this one. Super cool. You can do text effects. So this is actually just layering different axes of the variable font. And then I added an animated gradient in the text with some background clip. I made this for Christmas because I thought it was super cute. But I love this one because it's got these little like bubbly bits in it. It kind of looks like candy. You can do simple sort of individual character animations. This is using a Google variable font called Fira Code, my favorite code font. This one uses Chi by Ono Typeco, which is one of my favorite variable fonts. I'm not sure how easy it is to see, but the way this works is as the snow falls within the, I guess, kind of snow globy effect, it builds up on the bottom, but also the text itself gets sort of fatter and wider at the bottom and narrower at the top as the animation goes on. Or you could do something simple like this one. And I love this demo because what this shows is how we're actually editing the font itself when we're transitioning. So I've applied a text shadow to this. So as the axes animate and transition away, the text shadow disappears with it as well. And what's really interesting to note about this one in particular is this is one of the first demos that I made. And when I first made it, Chrome had such a hard time rendering this. Like my fans would spin up and the laptop felt like it was on fire. But as time's gone on, the performance and the rendering of this has really, really improved. So it's kind of great to have seen how the browsers have been improving things over time to make variable fonts more performant in the browsers, as well as, you know, allowing me to totally abuse their rendering engine and make stuff like this with like a 25 bazillion pixel text shadow. This one is a new one, which you might have seen if you follow You Gotta Love Front End on Twitter. I actually made this on the weekend. It's my custom font called Jello Jiggle. And I desperately wanted to make it so that it kind of looked a little bit like Jello. I made this using an app called Glyphs, which is super cool. Highly recommend if you want to make variable fonts. I only made the letters J, E, L, and O, but you get the point. It's super neat. And I like this one because when you combine it with different CSS text effects, you can kind of create that see-through wobbly Jello feel. I really want to make this work with like shaking your phone or something like that. Now this one, I wanted to show, I'm just going to show it first and then I'll explain why I like it. So I'll just click over here. Sorry, just looking over at my dragon. Fire. So what I'm doing here is talking into my microphone and giving my dragon marshmallow an instruction, and then he breathes fire in the words that I said. What is so great about this is because that is just text, it means that I can make that word say whatever I want by listening to the speech recognition in the browser. Just jump back over to my slides. No. Sorry. There we go. And I think what is extra special about it is that traditionally when we create fun interactions like this, it would be restricted to something like SVG or Canvas. And if you wanted to change it, you'd have to create all the letters and put it all together. But because this is just text, all it's doing is listening to the word, waiting for it, and then printing it out on the page. And I'm just adding some CSS to it to make it animate and look like fire and create all the layers. And I love that idea because it means that our text content can start to blend and form and become part of the design rather than kind of this separate static thing that's added onto it. So I think that is really, really cool. And on that, it's not just that these are beautiful or cool effects, right? What they demonstrate is that as designers and developers, we can control the font itself. And that means that variable fonts allow typography on the web to adapt to the flexible nature of our screens, our environments, and our devices. And that includes things like media queries, like dark mode, for example. So if we wanted to change our variable font based on dark mode, all we need to do is change the font variation settings property or one of the registered axes like font weight inside the prefers color scheme media query. So you could do something like this, for example. So when it's light, it says ooze. And when it goes to dark mode, it actually oozes. I think this is really funny. And when I made it, I was super proud of myself. I made it around Halloween, so I thought it was like perfect because it's dark mode, obviously. Now, this is kind of like a silly example, but more practically, you can modify the contrast and the styles to ensure better legibility and accessibility. So when we're thinking about something like color contrast, we're pretty much just thinking about color a lot of the time. But fonts play a really big role in how legible text can be. So if your font is really narrow and it's kind of a light color, that might not be as legible as if it was a little bit thicker, like a thicker weight. So variable fonts allow us to modify things like the weight or the optical size or other axes to suit different color schemes and modes. And more interestingly, when we have a variable font, it also means that our users have access to that. So if they want to create their own custom style sheet for accessibility reasons, they also have access to the variable font axes, meaning they can customize the experience to suit their needs more precisely. Now, I don't know about you, but that's really exciting to me. I like giving users the option, especially if it's for accessibility purposes. And as CSS develops, we'll have more access to different environmental and system features that'll allow us to take advantage of our users' unique circumstances, but also allow our users to take advantage of that as well. But it also means that we can adjust our typography to things like screen width. So that might allow us to tweak the font weight, the width, and the optical size, or again, other axes to be more readable on larger or smaller screens. So maybe where the viewport is really wide, the text is more detailed and a bit finer, whereas on a smaller screen, maybe it's a little bit heavier and a little bit thicker, so it's easier to read. There's also other benefits, like if you want the text to fit within a confined space, which seems to be something people like to complain about with CSS. So this example, this is a div with some text in it. It's a little bit janky as I do this, but nobody does this on the web, only developers do this. But as I adjust it, you can kind of see that the text is getting bigger, but it's not just getting bigger in font size or smaller in font size, it's actually being condensed. So I'm adjusting the width of the variable font to fit within the space that I'm defining. This is really, really exciting because we don't have to have text that awkwardly wraps or awkwardly doesn't fit and overflows the box anymore. Another example of this, which I like to show because it comes up a lot for people and it's a bit of a bugbear for me as a front-end developer, is that, you know, when you get these like amazing, beautiful designs and they fit perfectly at these very specific breakpoints that they were designed at, and then you build it and it just like falls apart in the in-between states and it doesn't really work, that annoys me. With variable fonts, you don't need to do that. You could just adjust the width a little bit so that it condenses a little bit as the screen gets smaller, rather than having it wrap at these kind of awkward points, like I'm doing in this example. And it's not super noticeable, so I am reducing the size, but I'm also condensing it. And this allows us to have more control over our designs and how they're represented across different devices or within different spaces. And I think that means that we can maintain the integrity of our designs rather than kind of having these in-between awkward states or having to put in a bazillion breakpoints to kind of get it to work. My goal in life is to have as few breakpoints as possible, but a fully responsive design. Now, this uses a little bit of JavaScript. And I want to show you the JavaScript because it's only a little bit. And once you have it, you can do all sorts of things with the exact code that I'm going to show you. So what we're going to do is we're going to match our font weight to our viewport size. As the viewport gets smaller, the font weight is going to get heavier. So we need a couple of things. First, we need the start and end points for both the font axis, so in this case weight, and then the event that we're going to use. So in this case, it will be the viewport width for resize. So we're going to have 200 to 900 for the axis range for weight, and then 320 pixels to 1440 pixels for the viewport size. First, we're going to get the current event state, which will be viewport width. So we can use something like window.innerWidth. Then we take the window.innerWidth as our current size, and we minus the minimum size of 320. And then we divide that by the maximum size of 1440 minus the minimum size of 320. And what that will give us is a decimal value of 0 to 0.99. And we're going to use that to calculate our font weight. Once we take our font weight, our decimal value, our window size of 0 to 0.99, We multiply that by the minimum weight of 200 minus the maximum of 900 plus the maximum of 900. And what that will give us is a font weight based on the size of the viewport between 320 and 1440. Then you update it in your CSS. Now you can do this however you normally would. I like to use CSS custom properties because I think they're great. So you can have a weight custom property. In the font weight, you just reference the var CSS function with the name of the custom property. So in this case, weight. And then in your JavaScript, you can set it by saying, style.setProperty weight, and then pass in the font weight that we just calculated before. When you put it all together, it looks like this. So you can turn this into a function where you can pass code to it. So, you can reuse it rather than it all being hard-coded within here. But it basically works like this. And then you add that function into an event listener for resize, and that's it. That's how I created this. I'm actually changing a few things. So the first paragraph, the heading as well, and the other text on the page as well. Now, like I said, you can use this code for any kind of event. So you could change things based on scroll. Instead of passing the window resize, you're passing the scroll position through. It actually took me longer to figure out what word to put in this example than it did to make it because I already had the JavaScript and I just changed the values. It was pretty neat. You'll actually find that a lot of the variable font demos are using this exact piece of code, and I feel a little bit bad about it because I didn't optimize it or anything. But yeah, it's a pretty small, easy to use function. This one uses device position. It actually changes the slant of the text, and then once it hits a certain point, I slam it all into the side like I'm dropping it, because I drop my phone quite frequently, unfortunately, as you can see from the cracks in the screen. This one also uses device orientation. So what I've got going on here is as you rotate the phone, it individually changes the weight, but also the transform scale property of each letter. And it works with any number of letters. It just happens that I use Jello because I like using Jello's name in my examples. So, it's not just limited to viewport size. This example I want to show you actually in the browser because I think it's super cool. So you can kind of see here, this is detecting my mouse orientation. So as I move my mouse and the mouse position, I'm updating the different axes. This font is called Whoa by Scribbletone, and I think it is one of the most impressive variable fonts I've ever seen. It is super cool and really beautiful, and I'm not even using all of the axes that are available to create this. It is just a masterpiece. So I think it's so beautiful. I dropped my slides out again. Sorry about that, everyone. Another option that we have is changing the font based on audio input or the sound of your voice. Hopefully my slides don't drop out again when I switch back. So with this example, I can't see it because Zoom's in the way. There we go. Sorry. So with this, I'll just click here. And then as I'm talking, you can see that the text is changing. So the louder my voice is, the heavier the text is going to get. So if I stop talking, it goes to the narrow state. And then if I start talking again, you can see that it's moving around the place. And what I love about this example is things like Google Home and Alexa, the sort of speech to text interfaces are becoming more widely used and more available in people's homes. And when we're doing conversational UIs, when you represent text, it's always just this sort of emotionless output. I think variable fonts give us the opportunity to represent the tone and the intent of people's words rather than just this sort of static text. Now, it's not actually that easy to do for a number of reasons. Technically, the sort of APIs don't align super nice, but I definitely think that there is a future there with variable fonts and representing meaning and intent from a person's input. The last example that I want to show from a JavaScript input perspective is my favorite, and that is the ambient light sensor. So I'm just going to blind everyone by putting my phone torch up to the screen to show you how this works. So when I put my phone up to the ambient light sensor in my laptop, you can see that the text is responding to that input. So in low light environments, you can see that it's sort of the the lightweight of the font, and then in a highlight environment, it's the really heavyweight. Now I use this because I think it looks really cool in the demo purposes, but if you think about this from a practicality perspective, as people move between low light and highlight environments, if they're using like a tablet or something for your interface, you could adjust the weight so it's more legible in the low light environments to make it more usable and more accessible for people. The downside of this is that it's only supported in Chrome and Edge, and Firefox have announced that they have no intention to support it. I had hoped to convince them, but I'm not sure that that will happen given recent events. Safari may support it at some point, and I really hope that they do, because I think it has a lot of usability and accessibility benefits if we can get that into browsers. But it doesn't just have good practical uses. I think it also has a lot of creative uses. So this example is called Blooming GX by Typography. So Arthur, who made this font, makes the most spectacular variable fonts you'll ever see. And as I put the light up, you'll see that it grows flowers. And imagine this as a drop cap in your design, and then in a really bright environment, because flowers need sunlight, they all of a sudden get this beautiful growing flowers in their screen. Like, you could create a different feel of your web page depending on what the environment the user is in. And that to me is like super exciting for creative storytelling executions. Or you could just have it change into beautiful flowers on transition as people scroll down the page, or something like that. Kicking me out again. So before I finish up with the examples, I had to sneak this one in. So Arthur, who made that G, also made an alphabet of letters from A to Z. And in that, he made a Jello for J, where you can pat Jello in a variable font, which was probably the greatest thing that I've ever seen in my life. You should definitely go and check out his work to see some really beautiful creative executions of variable fonts, and to kind of see the options that are available in variable fonts, and also in this case, a color font, which is what this one is. There is not very many limitations to variable fonts, especially when you see something like this that Arthur has made. So it's only because the variable font gives us more control over these elements that we can fine tune them, and we can fine tune the characteristics to maximize the things like legibility, readability, and the accessibility of our website text. And I know that some of my examples might seem trivial, but what they are demonstrations of possibilities, because this is a level of control over our fonts and our text that we've never had before. And what I'm kind of hoping is that when you have looked at some of these examples, it kind of sparks your creativity to come up with ideas of how you can use it. Because I guess from my perspective, there's never been a better time to be a developer or a designer for the web. And variable fonts are one of the things that we've gained in recent years that open up doors that never existed before. They give us opportunities to think more creatively for our users. And I think because technology like CSS and JavaScript is always improving, we have a lot more opportunities than we've ever had before to combine, create, and present content on the web in more creative, more meaningful, and more purposeful ways. And we can do so in a way that is performant and accessible as well. So I guess with a variable font, at the very least, we can improve the performance of our website. But at best, we can also make it more usable, more accessible, and have more meaningful, creative content. And I think that is what gets me super duper excited about the future of web typography with variable fonts, because really a lot of the limitations that we faced before can just be completely blown away by using a variable font. So with that, Thank you very much. Some good resources. My website, variablefonts.dev, b-fonts.com for a list of fonts, the Glyphs app if you want to make a variable font, and also some totally amazing people that you can go and check out, like Jason, David Bello, Ono Typeco, Scribbletone, and Typature for the amazing A to Z variable fonts. Thanks so much, everybody.